BMW, the logo everyone knows, the symbol of luxury, speed, and German engineering. But behind this famous badge is a story the company does not like to talk about. A story of forced labor, secret family fortunes, built in the darkest chapter in history, and a billion-dollar fine most people never heard of. This is the dark history of BMW. BMW stands for Bavarian Motor Works. It was founded in Germany in 1916. At first, the company did not make cars at all. It made engines for airplanes. The very first BMW engine was designed for fighter aircraft during World War I. It was considered one of the best aircraft engines of its era. Engineers at the time described it as unusually reliable at high altitudes. For a company just starting out, this was a major achievement. But Germany lost World War I, and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 banned German companies from making aircraft engines entirely. BMW had to change direction fast. By the 1920s, BMW moved into motorcycles. Then, in 1928, it started making cars. The company grew steadily. It built a name for quality and performance, and for a while, things looked promising. But in the 1930s, everything in Germany changed. A new government took power, and BMW's fate became tied to one of the darkest periods in human history. In 1933, the Nazi Party took control of Germany. The country began preparing for war, and aircraft engines were suddenly valuable again. BMW's expertise made it a natural partner for the German military. The company stopped acting like a normal business. It became a key supplier for the war machine. Without BMW's engines, the German Air Force would have been significantly weaker. Production targets kept rising. The German military needed more engines, more aircraft, more output, and as demand exploded, BMW needed more workers. Fast. This is where the company made a choice that still defines its history today. BMW used forced labor. Thousands of people were taken from occupied countries across Europe and forced to work in BMW factories. Many came directly from concentration camps, including Dachau, one of the first and most notorious camps in Nazi Germany, located just a few miles from BMW's main Munich factory. Think about that for a moment. The workers who built BMW's engines were prisoners. They had no rights, no pay, and no way to leave. By the end of the war, at one major BMW factory in Munich, 9 out of every 10 workers were forced laborers, prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, people whose lives had been taken from them completely. The conditions were brutal. Historical records show that dozens of forced laborers died every month from hunger, exhaustion, and mistreatment. They worked long shifts in cold factories. They were given little food. They had no medical care. BMW has since admitted this history publicly. The company has stated that under the Nazi regime, it operated as a supplier to the German arms industry, and that forced laborers, convicts, and concentration camp prisoners were used in its factories. When the war ended in 1945, BMW's factories lay in ruins. Allied bombing had destroyed much of its production capacity. The company was banned from making aircraft engines or automobiles. To survive, BMW made pots and pans, bicycles, kitchen equipment. One of the most powerful industrial companies in Germany was reduced to producing household items just to keep the lights on. It was a humiliating fall, but it was not the end. And the story of how BMW recovered involves a family whose own dark history had barely begun to surface. In the years after World War II, a wealthy family named Quandt began acquiring a controlling stake in BMW. The patriarch, Günther Quandt, had built a vast industrial empire before and during the war. He was not just a businessman. He joined the Nazi Party in 1933. A few years later, he received an official title directly from Adolf Hitler, a leader of the wartime arms economy. His factories produced batteries, weapons, and military equipment for the German war machine. His factories are estimated to have used tens of thousands of forced laborers, and his companies also benefited from the Nazi policy of forcing Jewish business owners to sell their assets far below value, a process known as Aryanization. When Günther Quandt died in 1954, his 2 sons Herbert and Harold inherited an enormous fortune, a fortune that had been built, at least in part, on the suffering of forced laborers. And then something extraordinary happened. By 1959, BMW was nearly bankrupt. The post-war recovery had been slow. The company was making tiny microcars at the low end of the market and expensive luxury sedans at the top. Neither sold well enough. The bills were piling up. And then Daimler-Benz, BMW's greatest rival, made its move. Daimler offered to take over BMW completely, not to save it, to absorb it. The plan was to turn BMW's factories into suppliers for Mercedes-Benz vehicles. BMW, as an independent brand, would effectively disappear. The shareholders' meeting on December 9, 1959, was supposed to be the last day of an independent BMW. The management had already recommended accepting the deal, but the meeting turned chaotic. Small shareholders stood up and shouted at the board. Workers' representatives rejected the takeover loudly. There was shouting, there was anger. An accounting error in BMW's own financial documents was discovered mid-meeting, which forced the vote to be delayed. And in that moment of confusion and delay, Herbert Quandt made his decision. Herbert Quandt was almost completely blind. A retinal disease had damaged his sight since the age of 9, but he saw something in BMW that others didn't. He believed the company could be saved. He increased his share in BMW to nearly 50%, risking most of his personal fortune against the advice of his own bankers. The Daimler takeover was rejected. BMW survived as an independent company. Within a few years, BMW launched a new line of cars that filled the middle market perfectly. Orders flooded in. The company grew fast. By the 1970s, BMW had transformed into the premium brand we know today, challenging Mercedes-Benz itself. Herbert Quandt died in 1982. His children, Stefan Quandt and Suzanne Klatten, inherited his BMW shares. Together, they still control almost 47% of the company today. Susanna Klatten is estimated to be worth over $25 billion, making her one of the wealthiest women in the world. For decades, the family's history during the Nazi era was not widely known outside Germany. That changed when investigative journalists and historians began digging deeper. In 2007, the German magazine Der Spiegel published a major investigation into the Quandt family's wartime activities. Facing public pressure, the family commissioned an independent historian, Professor Joachim Schultisek, to investigate. His report, published in 2011, confirmed what many had suspected. The Quandt family had profited directly from forced labor. They had benefited from the forced sale of Jewish-owned businesses, and Günther Quandt had been deeply embedded in the Nazi system, not as a bystander, but as an active participant in the war economy. In 2022, journalist David de Jong published a book called Nazi Billionaires, which examined in detail how some of Germany's wealthiest families, including the Quandts, built their fortunes during this period. This means the family that still owns nearly half of BMW today built part of their foundational wealth using forced labor, not just through BMW, but across an entire industrial empire. The family has since acknowledged this history and funded some research and philanthropic work, but many critics argue that formal financial reparations to the descendants of forced laborers have been insufficient compared to the scale of the wealth involved. After the war, after the crisis, after Herbert Quandt's gamble paid off, BMW rebuilt itself into something new. The 1970s and 1980s brought iconic models. The brand became a global symbol of driving pleasure and premium quality. Factories opened across the world. Revenue grew into the tens of billions. But history has a way of repeating certain patterns. Decades after the war, BMW would find itself at the center of another major scandal. This time, not about forced labor or family secrets, but about something more familiar to modern consumers: money, competition, and the air we breathe. In the 2000s, European regulators started investigating something unusual. For years, some of Germany's biggest car companies, BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, Porsche, and Daimler, had been holding secret technical meetings. On the surface, this seemed normal. Car companies often cooperate on shared technology standards, but investigators found something very different inside those meetings. The companies had developed technology that could dramatically reduce harmful diesel emissions. This was not a small improvement. The technology, systems using a chemical called AdBlue, could reduce nitrogen oxide pollution by up to 95% compared to older methods. Nitrogen oxide is a serious health risk. It contributes to lung disease and is estimated to cause tens of thousands of premature deaths in Europe every year. So here is the key question. These companies had the technology to make their cars far cleaner. Why didn't they use it? According to European regulators, the answer was money. Better emissions technology was more expensive to install fully. So instead of competing to build the cleanest cars possible, the companies allegedly agreed together to limit how effective the technology would be. They chose a lower performance standard and then locked each other into it, so no single company would gain a competitive advantage by going further. It was, in the words of the European Commission, an illegal cartel. A group of competitors secretly agreeing not to compete on something that directly directly affected public health. In 2021, the European Commission ruled that the 5 companies had violated competition law. The fines were massive, 875 million euros in total. BMW alone was ordered to pay more than 370 million euros, approximately $400 million. Volkswagen received the largest fine. Daimler avoided the fine entirely because it had reported the cartel to regulators first, receiving full legal immunity under European whistleblower rules. BMW denied wrongdoing and argued the Commission had exaggerated the scope of the coordination. The company said the meetings did not amount to a cartel in the way regulators claimed, but the numbers tell their own story. BMW earned almost 99 billion euros in revenue in 2021, the same year they were fined. The fine of 370 million euros represented less than 0.4% of annual revenue. Critics were blunt. For a company that size, the fine was the equivalent of a parking ticket. BMW's history across more than 100 years shows a pattern that is uncomfortable to look at closely. In wartime, the company used forced laborers. The family that saved the company from bankruptcy in 1959 had built part of their fortune using forced labor. And decades later, with the war long over and the world watching, BMW still found itself at the center of an agreement that prioritized profit over the health of millions of people. Each chapter of this story happened in a different era. The people involved are different. The world is different. But in each case, the logic was similar. The cost of doing the right thing was seen as too high. BMW has, to its credit, publicly acknowledged its wartime past. It has funded memorials, supported historical research, and contributed to compensation funds for forced laborers. These are real steps, and they matter. But the emissions cartel, secret meetings, shared limits, documented by the European Commission, shows that acknowledgement alone is not the same as change.